Welcome to the last, but certainly not least, session of the day. This is one on capacity accreditation. This topic has come up throughout the day, so I'm really interested to hear what all our panelists have to say about it. I'm just going to introduce our moderator, Emma Nicholson, coming from FERC and now with Charles River Associate, Energy Economist. And Emma, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you very much, everybody. We really appreciate you hanging with us. I think this is a really exciting panel on resource adequacy refinements, and we're going to focus a lot today on the impacts that the refinements, which I think everyone agrees were needed, sort of the impacts that they have had on market participants and regulators. We have a commissioner up. So we're going to have 3 presentations first, and then we're going to have a panel discussion. So I would first call our first presenter, man who needs no introduction, Dr. Arne Olson of E3, who's a real expert, and he's going to give a capacity accreditation overview of a critical periods reliability framework.
Hey, thank you, Emma. I appreciate the battlefield promotion to doctor, but it's just Mr. is okay. But thank you for that. So I'm going to talk about the latest E3 white paper on resource adequacy, need determination, and accreditation. I thought I would try to provide just some theoretical sort of background for you. So I'm going to skip lightly over the theoretical concepts and then let all the panels drag you through the mud of all the gory details about how this actually gets done. The white paper is there, it's on our website. It's intended to address the 2 problems that are related in resource adequacy. There's a physical problem with how you ensure enough resources to have a reliable system. And there's a related economic problem with how you ensure efficient investment in new resources. And solving this problem requires a comprehensive mathematical framework. I can think of it as like the unifying theory of resource adequacy. It's a robust mathematical framework that accurately characterizes the conditions under which power supply may be inadequate to serve load and the incremental impacts of changes to the portfolio and helping you to avoid loss of load. Why do we need a scientific approach for resource adequacy need determination and accreditation? Because it's really important. It's too important not to do this scientifically. Determination of resource adequacy need is critical for electric system reliability and is a huge driver of electricity costs for consumers. Accurate accreditation is a primary signal for the value of new resources and is necessary for economically efficient investment. And if someone were interested in hedging their risks against volatile capacity spot markets, to do that, what you need is a fundamentals-driven, well-formulated spot market which you can reasonably anticipate potential price movements so that your hedges can be effective and that you know how much to pay for them. If you're doing your accreditation based on a heuristic, or even worse, based on politics, those are risks that aren't easy to hedge, and those will make your hedging activities likely ineffective. And the recent developments in the industry have really made it clear the need for a change in our traditional accreditation methods. We're already seeing that the hours that are critical for reliability are not necessarily the peak load hours. California's rotating blackouts on August 12th and 13th of 2020 occurred in the evening after the sun went down, not during the afternoon when load was highest. Relatedly, we're seeing that saturation and interactive effects among variable and energy limited resources are becoming increasingly important as the penetration of those resources grows, and accurately capturing those phenomena will be critical for accreditation and reliability. And while there's been so much attention paid on the accreditation of renewables up until now, what we really are seeing the last few years is that the accreditation of the thermal fleet is actually way more important than whatever we do with renewables and energy storage. And we've seen that our thermal resources have not performed at their accredited values during recent very extreme winter weather events. And so that makes it really critically important to accurately and scientifically accredit those resources as well. So the key periods of the key elements of the critical periods framework that you'll read about in our paper, which I'll go through one by one in my talk today, are the following four. The first step is to determine the total reliability need. This is based on the quantity of equivalent perfect capacity needed to meet a specified reliability standard. The second step is literally a derivative of the first step, which is to calculate the marginal ELCC of individual resources based on their contribution toward the total reliability need, which can also be read and seen through their expected performance during critical periods, as I will go through. The third step is to determine the total procurement need, which is different from the total reliability need, and because of the phenomena that we're talking about the critical periods moving in time. The total procurement need is the sum of the marginal ELCCs of the individual resources in a reliable portfolio, or equivalently, the expected load during the critical periods. Last step is to allocate that procurement need in a market to load serving entities, and that should be done based on their expected contribution to the need for capacity, i.e. their expected load during critical periods. Loss of load probability modeling is the foundation for all of this analysis, the foundation of the mathematics. Loss of load modeling can be thought of as an organized way to consider all of the conditions in which supply might not be sufficient to serve load, including very extreme weather, creating high loads in any season, summer, winter, and correlations between load and renewable supply conditions, energy and capacity limitations. Even though our megawatts are denominated in capacity, loss of load probability modeling and ELCC also capture energy limitations and any correlated outages, other dispatch limitations. We define the total reliability need as the quantity of perfect capacity that is needed to reach your selected resource adequacy target. 1 day in 10 years is this target that's most commonly used. There's nothing magic about that target other than it's like once in, a long while. Like the frequency with which you hope politicians won't get too mad if you have to shut off their people's lights. I don't think it's more economical and more scientific than that, but it could be. And if you wanted to make this extremely scientific, that fits in at the front end of this framework and becomes your standard off of which everything else is developed. Your planning reserve margin is the quantity of perfect capacity needed, your TRN, divided by the 1 and 2 peak load by convention. And again, you could do that a different way. By convention, it's divided by the 1 and 2 peak load minus 1. And that also considers, even though it's based on your peak, it also considers performance and loads throughout the entire year. It's not just a peak-based standard because the modeling considers every hour. The reliability, the PRM is really a residual calculation. It's not strictly needed in the construct, but it's convenient and it's useful because it helps you just understand what your need is and how it changes as your load changes. The conventional accreditation framework rests on simplifying assumptions that are increasingly inaccurate. In effect, we've been treating the capacity of a system as if it's a linear function of all of the resources in that system. And we have added up our capacity using a simple summation. The original version used the installed capacity method, add up all my megawatts. I know that my megawatts aren't always there. So I add a reserve margin on top of that to reflect the fact that my resources aren't all perfectly reliable. And I'm good to go. And that works as long as there are the following conditions occur. There are small differences in forced outage rates and performance among my resources. Each resource is independent, so there's no interactions between them. And then I can now incorporate forced outages through performance penalties and use a UCAP method instead of an ICAP method. And I get a little better. But even a UCAP method isn't good enough. It's not scientific enough. And the reason is because you rarely have loss of load when you have an average number of thermal resource outages. If a normal set of outages are happening, you're probably fine. What happens, the time that you're most likely to have loss of load is when you have more than usual, a greater than usual number of thermal outages. So when we add up all the resources that are offline during all the loss of load events that we observe, it's generally much higher than the E4D rate of the entire fleet. So even UCAP is an overestimate of the performance of the thermal fleet. So we need to move to a better framework. The critical periods framework is more accurate and it's more adaptable to a diverse resource mix. Here now we define the PRM just based on the need for equivalent perfect capacity. This now makes the PRM independent of the resource portfolio. It's only based on load and maybe operating reserves. Remember, in the old framework, the PRM was dependent on your accreditation. So the worse your accreditation was, the higher your resource, your need would be, the higher your PRM would be. Here our PRM is independent, and all of the resource infirmities are captured in the resource accreditation. This is necessary because we now have large differences in availability during critical hours. It would be absurd to credit solar or wind at their nameplate value alongside of gas or coal. There are significant interactions among resources, and ELCC values are dynamic based on the portfolio. So it's not a simple sum of the resources in the portfolio. It's actually a complex function of each of the individual resources in the portfolio. This complex function looks like this. The portfolio ELCC is a function of each of the resources. It's a multidimensional function. The marginal ELCC can be thought of as the change in the portfolio ELCC with the change in any one of the resources. So it's rise over run. In other words, it's the partial derivative of the portfolio ELCC function with respect to change in any one resource type. The functional form of the surface is unknowable. We only observe this through the functioning of our loss of load model, but we can measure the gradient of the surface at various points on it to help us understand how our total portfolio ELCC changes as we change the portfolio. So this reflects the fact that no resource is perfect. Every resource is compared to an equivalent perfect capacity resource, which creates a level playing field for all resources in the portfolio, again, accounting for all the factors that can affect resource availability during the critical hours, including energy availability, hourly variability in output, duration, use limitations, correlated outages, temperature-related derates, et cetera. Now, we need to recognize, and a key part of the paper is understanding that there's a difference in the sum of the marginal ELCCs and the total amount of capacity that the portfolio provides. These are the interactive effects. And it's really actually mathematically impossible. There's no mathematically unique way to allocate these diversity effects, these portfolio effects among individual resources in the portfolio. You can really only think of them as belonging to the portfolio as a whole. And that becomes important for procurement, especially in the market context, as we'll see. So the marginal ELCC framework is important for both system planning and markets. For system planning, we need accurate marginal accreditation to identify optimal resource additions. We don't need to accredit existing resources just for planning. We just need to know how much total capacity, cumulative capacity our existing resources give us, and then how much new capacity, new resources give us. The market implementation is a little bit different because we do have a need to accredit existing resources in the market. And we have to accredit them based on market concepts also at that marginal level, the marginal ELCC. Why? Well, because first of all, existing resources are a perfect substitute for new resources. We need to accredit new resources accurately to have efficient investment. We need to accredit existing resources the same as new resources because they're perfect substitutes for each other. And because in a market, all grid services are compensated at their marginal value. That's what markets do. That's what sends efficient signals. That's what our markets are supposed to do. For system planning now, we can take these ELCC concepts and sketch them out over large changes to the portfolio, creating ELCC curves and or surfaces in multiple dimensions. This helps us understand as I change the amount of resources I have in the portfolio along any dimension, how much the total reliable value of my portfolio changes. That's what helps me understand how to make efficient investments in my system. In markets, again, we accredit all of the resources based on those marginal values. But we have to introduce this new concept, which I mentioned earlier, called the total procurement need, which is less than the total reliability need by the amount of those interactive effects. So the total procurement need is in effect the sum of all the marginal ELCCs in a reliable portfolio. And all the math is in the appendix of the paper. So you can go and trace that all out if you're of the mind to do that. And I expect in this room, some people will want to do that, which is exciting. For most of the rest of us, we've sketched out just a graphic of this on the top right there to help understand what this blob is, this difference between the total amount of portfolio ELCC and the sum of the marginal ELCCs. It's two things at the same time. It's both the interactive effects that I get from a portfolio of a whole bunch of different resources, that where the marginals add up to my net peak. I'm confident because it derives from the loss of load math that I have enough resources to meet the gross peak. In fact, all loads up to a 1 day and 10-year standard. So I know that those daytime hours in California, as you see on the graphic there, are no longer binding. The hours that are binding are the ones after sundown. If I procure based on marginal ELCCs up to the load after sundown, my model tells me, my math tells me that I have enough for all of the other hours. So that difference is both the portfolio effects of the resource portfolio and also the difference between load during the gross peak and the new critical period load peaks that I'm procuring to. This means that the procurement need can be lower than the peak load. And in fact, PJM now is procuring 91.7% of its peak load as its procurement need. So what the paper tries to do is just describe where most of the markets are moving and where many of the utilities are moving as well. It doesn't really break new conceptual ground. It really reiterates concepts that are out there, but hopefully puts them together in a framework that kind of ties together the planning and the markets. And just to show you a map of all of the markets that are moving towards this framework in general, New York ISO was the first one, PJM, MISO, and ISO New England is also proposing to move to an MRI approach. They're all using different computational methods. And we'll hear a lot today about the different computational methods, but they all are largely doing the same conceptual thing, which is looking at those critical periods when we really need the resources, when we're most likely to have a loss of load event, looking at how each resource performs during those types of events and using that as the basis for both need, procurement determination, and resource accreditation. And then lastly, I'll make one final point about an aspect of the framework that none of the markets are really doing yet. MISO is the closest to this. They're looking at this, which is to allocate the need also based on that load during the critical hours. Most of the markets are still allocating need based on the peak hours, even as their accreditation recognizes that the resource performance is most important during the critical hours. And this creates a disconnect between the signals that are sent to loads and the signals that are sent to resources. This is most easy to understand using an electric vehicle example from California, where we're actively encouraging people to charge their electric vehicles during the daytime when we don't have a resource crunch. This increases the peak load and might increase an LSC's allocation of the system-wide need, thereby increasing their costs, even while it's helping the system become more reliable and reducing costs for the system as a whole. So you can see the perverse incentive that this sends and the need to correct this by targeting our resource and need allocation to the LSCs based on their contribution to the actual need on the system, which is during the critical hours. So I hope that was helpful as an overall framework, and I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arne. That was an excellent overview of the topic of our panel today, is that there's a lot of these refinements are generally viewed as a very good thing, but there's been some growing pains experienced as we are improving capacity, accreditation, and procurement across the US. And our next presenter is Dr. Walter Graf, who's a chief economist at PJM Interconnection, and he's going to explain PJM's refinements and how they accredit resources today.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. And that was really a fantastic introduction to the topic, because I would say what PJM does is largely aligned with that, even up to the last slide where we're falling a little short of on the cost allocation piece. I think that basically the framework that Arne laid out is what PJM is trying to do. And so what I'll do over the next 10 minutes is talk through some of the details and some of the interesting lessons learned as we developed it. Before I jump in, I just wanted to focus on one element that Arne touched on, but maybe just to give it a few more seconds, just to help to motivate why we why we moved to the accreditation framework that we have now, the marginal accreditation, and especially why we saw that it was so important to improve on the forced outage rate based accreditation. The fundamental sort of motivating observation is that when you accredit according to forced outage rate, it doesn't actually tell you, it doesn't align with the expected performance from those resources during the periods that you actually face resource adequacy risk on the system. And the reason for that is that forced outages across different resources and different resource types are not entirely uncorrelated. So we're not sort of rolling the dice entirely independently across resources. On a particularly cold day or a particularly hot day, there are factors that influence resource outages sort of across the fleet. And so what we saw is that on these particularly cold days and particularly hot days, when load is at its highest in summer and in winter, it was also the case that forced outages are sometimes not so bad and sometimes sort of catastrophically bad. And it's those specific times that lead to essentially the only resource adequacy risk that you have on the system. And so that's sort of the motivation why we really wanted to dive into, in some sense, the motivation was just as much trying to get the risk modeling right as much as it was trying to get the accreditation right. Because like Arne said, the accreditation really just pops out of the risk model. I don't really have to spend too much time on this. PJM has what we call an ELCC framework, but really we calculate it in a way that's just consistent with MRI, just like New York and New England. I probably don't have to go through the math because Arne already did. Okay, so just to give an overview of how PJM puts these pieces together, and I'll try to keep an eye on the time. PJM looks at 30 years of weather history going back to 1993. And we derive, using those weather inputs and using other inputs as well, we derive a load forecast model essentially for each historical weather scenario. And then we also, and I'm going to focus a little bit more on this in the next couple of slides, we take a projected resource mix and performance for the delivery year in question, and we model the unit, the class, and the fleet performance for thermal and variable generation as a sort of stochastic function of temperature by resampling against historical availability, for which we have data not back 30 years, but back to 2012. And I'll talk about sort of how we match the historically observed performance to the longer weather history in a bit. And then we plug all of these into a giant Monte Carlo simulation model where we take the 31 different weather years, different load scenarios for each of those years, and 100 alternate resource adequacy performance draws for each of those 31 times 13, and you get something like 40,000 simulated years. And then we calibrate that model to the 1 in 10 because our accreditation is sort of calibrated to a system experiencing 1 in 10 risk. And just like Arne said, we just take the derivative to see how much any given resource improves reliability. Just one maybe item of interest, while we calibrate to a performance target that is expressed in LOLE terms, 1 in 10 LOLE, our ELCC ratings are actually based on relative improvement, the improvement that a given resource or given resource class has in terms of EUE reliability assessed in EUE terms relative to the improvement that a perfect resource has. I think I'm going to skip this. So we construct hourly load scenarios, so 365 times times 24 hours times some number of different scenarios for each of the weather years using our PJM load forecast model, which conveniently transitioned to an hourly model right just in time for us to implement these changes when we were considering them. And we essentially have inputs to that model that take the 31 weather years and apply what we call a weather rotation in order to essentially get sort of a what if scenario. What if this weather had occurred on days that looked a little bit different, particularly along the dimension of day of week. And so we get out of that sort of some additional load profiles, and we add some load variability as well, sort of accounting for essentially, you can think about it as load forecast error or model error, the residual in the model. And then I'm going to talk just a bit about how we model each of the different resource classes in the accreditation model. For thermal resources, which we call unlimited resources, we take forced outages and ambient derates matching historical weather, and we take planned and maintenance outages where they're basically calibrated to historically observed planned and maintenance outage patterns. So they're not exactly what was observed in terms of specifically when a given resource took a maintenance outage, but there's a little bit of a heuristic in how we do that. For variable resources, actually, let me jump to this one because I think I'm running low on time. I think this is sort of one of the key concepts. We use an approach in order to try to mix and match in a way that is sort of appropriate and respects historical data to try to answer the question of what's the distribution of how any given resource class and the fleet would have performed if a certain weather pattern had occurred on a given day, and that weather pattern was sort of matched with the load forecast associated with that weather pattern. So the way that we do that is by essentially grouping the temperatures. In winter, we group by daily low temperature. In summer, we group by daily high temperature, and essentially matching sort of similar observations across the 30-year history. And when we're simulating a given weather year for the delivery year, we look at for each day what weather or temperature bin that day falls into, and then look at the historical data back to 2012 and sample from one of the historically observed fleet-wide performance patterns. And importantly, we sample fleet-wide, which means that we preserve all of the correlations across different resources within a resource class, and we preserve correlations across resource classes, say between wind resources and solar resources and thermal resources and so on. And so what we get out of that is something that captures the relationship between performance and temperature, but even beyond that, preserves the relationship, sort of the correlated nature of forced outages and resource performance. Even beyond that, that can be sort of directly explained by temperature. And I think I just went through this. And then you put that all together. So you do that on the resource performance side, and on the load side, you basically say, okay, this is the load that I have to meet. We do have a little bit of a dispatch logic in there for when storage resources are dispatched, for when demand resources are dispatched, and so on. But essentially, in each day, you're just trying to answer the question: did I or did I not have enough generation in order to meet the load on this day? And this is what pops out. What we end up seeing in PJM is that, in contrast to sort of our historically observed or what we believe to be our historical risk patterns based on peak load conditions, where the majority of the risk occurred in summer to a great degree. What we see in PJM now is that a large share of the risk does in fact occur in the winter, when our peak loads are something like 10% lower than peak loads in the summer. And the big driver of that is the variability of resource performance in the winter. So I think my time is up, and I really look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Walter. That was a great overview of PJM's recent capacity accreditation refinements. And now we move on to Michael Robinson, who's Principal Market Designer at MISO, and he's going to explain their direct loss of load accreditation approach. Please go ahead. And I forgot to note, we can take questions at the end of the panel, so please hold your questions.
Great, thank you. Did any of you have a chance to come to this city of brotherly love over the weekend before this conference? If you did, you had a really good opportunity to see, if you walk a mile and a half northwest, which way is northwest from here? I'm not sure, but if you walk them that way, mile and a half northwest of here to the Schuylkill River on Boathouse Row, they had, over this past weekend, one of the biggest, most populated rowing regattas in the country, one of the top three. Over 8,000 participants, over 2,500 boats, over 300 rowing clubs racing in Schuylkill. These are the boats you see in the Olympics and the collegiate crew, either sculling boats or sweep boats. And over 2 days, from dawn to dusk, weather was good. But you can't have all these 8,000 participants or 2,500 boats racing against each other. That wouldn't be appropriate. Okay, I'm racing in a Masters Men's 8 sweep boat. That's where each rower only has one blade. Masters Men's 8, all of us 60 and over. Would not be appropriate for us to race teenage men or teenage women in a pair or a double. And it's not because we're good. No, we're not. We'd get waxed by them. Okay. And so as a result, they put you in classes. You have single sculls, men and women, different age groups. You have pairs, which are 2 individuals, either men or women, with one blade each, or doubles, 4s, quads, and then 8s. Men's, masters, mixed, different classes. And so that's what we do with capacity accreditation as well. So in the past, before we started moving to this direct loss of load modeling approach, our job was much simpler. So I've been at MISO since 2002 or so, a long time. And when we first started doing the loss of load studies, we observed that the risk always was in the summertime, at the time of MISO's peak, coincident with MISO's peak. In fact, a little bit of historic information here. When we did the loss of load studies back then, we would typically would only get 5 out of all the hours in a year. We'd get 5 non-zero loss of load probabilities. So that tells you if you're intimate at all with some of MISO's instruments, why we have a requirement for emergency only resources to be available at most 5 times during the summer. That's where the 5 comes from. But yeah, system risk was correlated with the coincident peak at MISO, and we had thermal resources. And so if you could have enough generation to meet the coincident peak, no worries, you could cover the rest. But Arne showed that And also Walter showed that times have changed. Now with renewables, we have risk across all seasons. And so it's appropriate to now think about accrediting resources, not only by class, but individually by how they can contribute at the times of greatest system risk. And so what we created is what we call resource adequacy hours. Now, definition is we're going to look at all the hours in a year, excuse me. We're going to look at all the hours in a year where we've declared a max gen alert or something worse than that. Max gen event, max gen warning. If we don't have enough, then we have some rules where we go out and gather additional hours up to 65, where we have the tightest operating margins. And what you see in this graph, I know it's a little bit small here, but on the horizontal axis, on the abscissa axis is just we've enumerated the days in the season. We have a seasonal construct, and so just those, we just enumerated the days up to 90, 91, depending on the season. And then on the ordinate axis, we have the resource adequacy hours that we've just defined. And what you can see here is that for the fall, summer, and winter, there's quite a bit of sort of distribution across all the different days in the season. We have some risk. The different colors represent, the blue represents our north central region, and then the red represents the south region. But for the spring, because we've defined the spring as being March, April, and May, you can see that there's not sort of randomly distributed across the entire season. That most of the risk is in the latter part of May because it gets hot in May. And so maybe we haven't defined the seasons right. That's a different question we can talk about. But clearly, the resource adequacy hours at risk are heavily distributed in the latter part of May. And so this tells you that we can't just focus on the coincident peak MISO in the summertime to assess the accreditation of resources. We need to look at all times of system risk. And so we've done that. And so we're using a two-step approach called the direct loss of load methodology. And the first part is a forward-looking approach. And Walter had a nice slide that talked about the Monte Carlo effort. We do something similar. I don't think we have nearly as many runs as you guys do, but we do a lot of Monte Carlo runs. Looking forward, trying to assess on a resource class basis. Okay, so resource class, a gas combustion turbine, one class, gas combined cycle, all like that. That's why I told you the story up front, talk about classes. That's how we tie it in. On a resource class basis, we're going to look at the contribution that class is given in terms of total system generation that's available when we have the greatest system risk. Okay, and then the second step is a backward looking where we assess the contribution of every individual resource. And so the better you are as a resource in terms of planning your outages and being available at the times of system risk, the more accreditation you get. So here's the first step, the forward looking. This is Monte Carlo. I'm not going to go through this. Arne talked about this. Walter talked about this. We do the Monte Carlo looking forward. The key words here and this one here is expectation. We're trying to figure out the expectation that a resource class, how much do we expect it to contribute at the times of expected system risk? The two expectations there. How do we expect the resource class to contribute when we're at greatest risk on an expectation basis? We do that across Monte Carlo, all the hours in the year, multiple runs, and then we look at those hours that have less than the 3% operating margin. We identify those. And it's those hours where we look at, for each resource class, how much are they contributing to the generation? That's forward-looking. That gives you, on a forward-looking basis, that's going to give, on a resource class basis, the size of the pie, the slice of the pie. How big of a slice of the pie is this particular resource class getting in terms of contributing to generation to address expected system risk during those hours. What's the size of that, the slice of that pie for that class? Then we go to backward looking, and out of that slice for that particular resource class, now we're going to look at the individual contribution for a resource in that class. Okay, and we're gonna look at, were they available to be able to contribute to help meet the system balance during that time, and so we'll look at that's how we accredit individual resources. So resources within a class are competing with each other in terms of getting a resource. If it's more available, it's going to get a higher accreditation value than someone else in that class, and it has to sum up to the resource class accreditation. So it boils down to, in terms of backward looking, where forward looking is an expected value. What are we expecting these class to contribute during the expected system risk hours? When we go back and look at the backward looking, it's how they actually contributed during those actual hours of system risk. So that's what we call Schedule 53A. That's your in front of the meter resources. That's been filed at FERC. That's been accepted. It drops in. It becomes effective sometime in 2028. We're giving market participants time to adjust. Now we're in we just filed something at FERC. It's still before FERC. We're calling it 53B resources. We have a host of resources that are emergency only. They meet our resource adequacy requirements, and but they're only callable under emergencies. Okay, so and so we don't call on them a lot. Okay, in the first 10 years at MISO, we called on these resources 4 times over 10 years. August 1st, 2006, February 3rd, 4th, and 5th of 2007. In the last 10 years, you can probably count on 3 hands how many times we've called on these, not many. So there's the question about how do you credit these when we rarely call on these resources. And so that's one of the tasks we're facing here. We have these resources when we had just the concern about the system peak, it was a much easier task. We could look at the load behind this particular asset if it's a demand resource. Look at, say you had an air conditioning program that was qualifying as an emergency only. Well, we know what the expectation is for temperature and humidity in the MISO footprint at the time of MISO's peak. Typically in the Midwest, 92 degrees Fahrenheit, 85% humidity was what we used to use. And so you could figure out how much an air conditioning program would be contributing. But now when you've have all these resource adequacy hours and risk across the entire year, you have to assess its value over all those years. And so what we're doing is, whereas with the in front of the meter resources, we have what are called resource adequacy hours, and we're weighting at 80% during the resource adequacy hours and 20% for the non-resource adequacy hours, because these resources are contributing to meet the energy balance every day in our market, in our energy markets, where the emergency resources, they don't have an obligation day by day, only under emergencies. And so we develop what are called capacity at risk hours. We're only going to look to accredit them when we have capacity risk hours. We're going to try to accredit them then. The accreditation for these types of resources doesn't depend upon your participation or your participation model. I think a word got dropped out. My apologies. The accreditation for these resources does not depend on your participation model. We have lots of different types of demand resources. And I didn't put the definitions in these acronyms: load modifying resources, demand response resources. Those will help to determine how you get deployed, whether you get compensated at LNP and your other obligations. But the accreditation, we're going to do differently, and we're going to accredit them by how we attempt to measure them through measurement and verification techniques. So we have all these different participation models, but in our tariff, it's called attachment TT. With demand resources, You can't put a meter on what wasn't consumed. So you have to try to measure the counterfactual. And the way we try to measure the counterfactual with these different techniques, we do a calculated baseline, which is a 10 and 10 baseline event, direct load control. That's where you have these old legacy water heater programs, air conditioning programs, where customers don't have interval meters, and you have to use some other statistical technique to try to estimate their contribution. Statistical intervals where you have thousands of customers with smart meters, but you're still going to do some sort of randomized controlled trial or something to be able to estimate their effects, and then the firm service level. So depending on how we're measuring them, we're using different accreditation techniques. And so the problem we need to solve here is, again, we don't call in these assets, but rarely. They have to report availability. In the past, they have not been reporting. They've been indicating that they're not available. That's not good. So we're trying to improve our techniques. If you're aware, there were a few cases, like 3 of market manipulation and fraud in MISO. With demand response assets, we've tried to address that through improved market rules. We've stood up a demand response team, try to follow these. We're asking for hourly load meter data for the load behind these assets to try to figure out what they are doing 24/7, so we can try to improve measuring the counterfactual. And yeah, we've driven our attempt to accredit these types of emergency only resources, driven up right straight off of how we do the in front of the meter generation resources. We're trying to look at what's been offered, what's available, what was the load during that moment, and then what's the maximum amount this could be accredited with. So this is filing we made at FERC. There's lots more details. And again, it really depends on how we're trying to measure these kinds of assets, where you can't put a meter on what wasn't consumed. And with that, I'll end it. Thank you.